Everybody's talking at me. Talk about it. Hello, talk to me.
Let's talk. Bill Padley on TRE. Talk Radio Europe.
Now, we've spoken to a few people who've undertaken some rather long bike rides, motorcycle I'm talking about here, and this story is a very different one. It's a book called Timeless on the Silk Road, an odyssey from London to Hanoi, and we cross to Australia now to speak to its author, Heather Ellis. Hi, Heather. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you. Good evening.
Yes, for you it is evening. Yeah, good evening to you. So let's start at the beginning here. Your kind of love of motorcycles went back to when you were a child, I think, living on a sheep station.
Yeah, I was, for about 3 years, we were living on a station near Coopapedy, which is an opal mining area. So my parents were opal mining, and my aunt and uncle owned this sheep station. So we were based on this Ingomar. It was 700 square miles.
Wow!
So it's a very big piece of land, and so we used to ride small motorbikes to muster the sheep. So that's when I first learnt to ride a motorcycle, and that's where it all came from, really. You know, from there I just continued riding motorcycles on farms, and then I moved to Kakadu National Park, where I worked at a uranium mine. And when I turned 18, I didn't buy a car. I bought a motorcycle because it was the best way to get around. And in Kakadu, there's lots of, great places to ride a motorcycle. And from there, it was just really a natural progression to go from, riding around on the weekend and going to different waterholes and gorges and camping to travelling around the world for 4 years.
Wow. The two things spring to mind as you were talking there. One is what a terrible life it must be for a sheepdog if you are working on a sheep farm that's 700 square miles. The dog must be knackered at the end of the day. And secondly, what great place names you have in Australia. The Kakadu. Did you say that last one was?
Yes, Kakadu National Park, and it's a magnificent place. It's just a wild, ancient land, very, steeped in the very old Aboriginal culture and beautiful landscapes. It's a World Heritage National Park. I worked there. I actually worked to the uranium mine on the fringe of Kakadu National Park, and I know that sounds such a contradiction to have a uranium mine right next to such a beautiful place, but it's also very rich in uranium. And I went there when I finished high school, and I worked there for about 2.5 years, and then I went backpacking to Europe. And I came back to work at the mine again with the plan to make some more money to go travelling. But I ended up with a really fantastic job working as a radiation safety technician. Wow. And, time slipped away. And then I was like 27 years old thinking, I'm just working here and there's a whole world out there I want to go and explore. And so I was at a barbecue with some friends one day, and that's when I blurted out, wouldn't it be great to ride a motorcycle to Africa? That's where my journey began, and my first book was Ubuntu, One Woman's Motorcycle Odyssey Across Africa. And so I rode through Africa. That was like 93 to sort of towards about July 94. And I ended up in London working as a motorcycle courier, and the next stage of the journey was going to be through Russia, and then along the Silk Road, and then down through China and Vietnam and Southeast Asia and back to Australia.
So that was the plan, and the plan was derailed somewhat. That's an understatement. When you, I believe, went for a test which was a requirement for a 3-month Russian visa.
Yeah, because I'd been sort of working as a motorcycle courier, and I called my like you become a road warrior.
Yeah.
because you're getting around in black leather and motocross boots, and then I sort of thought, it's time to move on, time to continue my journey. And I wanted that to be spending the winter in Moscow at the Moscow University studying Russian. So to have a 3-month visa, I needed to have a HIV test.
Right.
And off I went, and I had, the one unguarded moment in Africa, and that's kind of, that scene is all explained in my first book, Ubuntu, and how that happened. It's sort of with a few people that you felt comfortable with, and smoking a little bit of, a joint was being passed around, and drinking too many beers, and one thing led to another, and that's what sort of happened. But I put that whole thing behind me, and then I went for this test and thought nothing of it, and then they came back and said, you're HIV positive.
Oh,
and that was in September 1995. So that was before the effective treatments that we have today, which are basically as good as a cure. People who are living with HIV can live long, happy, healthy, productive lives, taking often just one pill a day with no side effects, and they're not infectious at all. There's a massive campaign now, they call it U equals U, undetectable equals untransmittable. But that was not how it was for me. It was basically a death sentence, and I was given 5 years to live, and I was still healthy. And I thought, well, the doctor said, you should go home to Australia, and, they'll look, back to your family and so forth. And I thought, well, I'm not going to do that. And just, because of around HIV, there's such a lot of stigma, and I was, you're very fearful of how you're going to be treated, and that, the end result is dying from AIDS. So I thought, well, I'll go on my one last journey, my one last kind of search for meaning, which unfolded in my first book, Ubuntu, because I really started believing in, the meaning behind chance encounters and coincidences, and trusting in my intuition. And in Africa, I always seemed to be saved in the nick of time. And I thought, I'll go traveling again because, maybe I will be okay, because not everyone gets sick, and, maybe something will. Maybe I will find, some secret holy grail type cure. And I thought, well, and besides that, like, what choice did I have? And so I packed my motorcycle, and the end result was Timeless on the Silk Road. And I called it Timeless because I was running out. I didn't have a lot of time, and I just felt it was a really appropriate word to describe my journey. And also the land I was traveling through and the culture I was traveling through is timeless. Yeah. It's a timeless part of the world, the cradle of civilization.
I mean, you tell it there, and hearing you is so inspirational, because a lot of people faced with what you were faced with would have just said, well, I'm going to bed and I'm putting the covers over my head and I'm not coming out until they take me out in a box. And you had quite the opposite, didn't you?
Yeah, well, I was still healthy at the time. So I thought, well, while I'm still healthy, I don't want to just go and cower in a dark room and have people, sort of treating me really bad and rejecting me. I mean, of course, like, my parents never rejected me, but I had this perception that I would, bring shame on my family, and they would be always saying to me, how could you be so stupid, and all this kind of thing. So I didn't want to deal with that, and I also didn't want to worry them. I thought, well, this is something that I just will deal with. And the situation is, at the time, before the antiretrovirals were discovered, which basically are as good as a cure and keep people alive and suppress the virus to undetectable levels. People were like just ending their lives. They didn't want to get sick. They didn't want to face that terrible, terrible death. Yeah. And it's like not a respectable death either, So I thought, well, no, just go traveling and see what happens. But, what kind of unfolded was and in the book, it's like written on, there's several layers to it. There's, the journey and the people I meet and the conversations I have with people and the kind of, in some way, they're always giving me hope and they're always encouraging me. They want me to complete my journey because I had a map on the side cover of my motorcycle, which was a Yamaha TT600, and they could see how far I'd traveled, like all the way from Australia, all the way through Africa, to London, and then all the way through Europe. And they were just wanting to, here I am, this single young woman, blonde woman, blue-eyed, on her own, traveling on this huge motorcycle. And she'd gone so far that they wanted me to continue and complete my journey. And I know, I traveled through many countries, and I would always offer money to people, when they would, I'd stay somewhere like a roadside cafe. I often asked to pitch my tent, and they would they'd feed me, and places like Turkmenistan, lots of vodka, and I was always very safe. No harm came to me. Nobody treated me badly. And when I'd go to pay at the end of, the next morning, they say, "Oh, no money. You're on a long journey. You keep your money. You have a long way to go." And that was happened all the time, all the time on my travels. And people always were, it's really, there is so much truth in that kindness of strangers. And, I think when you see all the horror that is going on in some parts of the world, and it's not everywhere. People start to lose faith in that kindness of strangers. And it's still there. I'm so convinced it's still there. It just doesn't go away. That's the true meaning of our humanity.
And so the trip itself, geographically, then you're setting off, and the reason it's called the Silk Road is this is the old trading routes, isn't it, across Asia?
Yeah. So I was just like all the other travelers going back, thousands of years that traveled on the Silk Road. This was the easiest and the quickest road for me to go on my motorcycle to get to Southeast Asia. When you go through, I couldn't really go through the Middle East. I didn't want to kind of go through that way. I mean, I had an interest in going through the Silk Roads, but to me, it just seemed the most direct and easiest way to go. So that's sort of what happened. And then I sort of ended up in Central Asia, and and it's quite funny, lots of these different scenes in the book, how I'm trying to get out of Central Asia because all the borders were closed to me. I went into those countries, these former Soviet Union countries, on a Russian visa because I didn't need to have a HIV test for a 1-month visa.
Right.
So once I got into Turkmenistan, I could go anywhere. The borders are very relaxed. You just cross over, they look at your passport. Yeah, no worries, off you go. In fact, I went from Kazakhstan, I took this kind of went through a small border into Russia. And the boom gate was up. It was like a wooden boom gate, and it was up. But my Russian visa had expired by 1 month, and I'm like, "Oh, yeah, you beauty! I have to." If they'd stopped me, they wouldn't have let me in. And then, later that day, I got stopped by the Russian police in a place called Barnell. And they took me to the police station. And they put me in a room, and the chair and single chair in the room, and the light bulb hanging from the roof, and interrogated me just out of a James Bond spy movie,
Wow.
And then they let me go. They escorted me out of Barnell, the police car, behind me, and they said, "You go back to Kazakhstan." And I think what happened is they said they were going to send me to Moscow, but if they had have done that, then the hierarchy would have said, "Well, how did she get into Russia in the first place? Weren't you manning the border? What are you doing out there in the provinces?" So I think they just wanted to get rid of me. But I actually turned around and snuck back through because I wanted to get into Mongolia through another border crossing called Tashanta. So there's lots of these really crazy sort of scenes in the book because you got to remember this is quite a very unique journey. Here I am. I'm going to die anyway, as far as I'm concerned. I have, it's a one-way street. So you kind of push the rules a little bit. You don't worry about rules and regulations.
Yes, I see what you mean. Yeah.
So that's why I was doing these kind of, a little bit crazy things.
Wow.
But, I survived to tell the tale. And it really, I wanted to write the book because I wanted people to understand that, our lives are so short, really, at the end of the day. And it's really important to live our dreams and, have an adventure every now and again and really value every moment in life.
That's, hearing you say that, from somebody who's gone through what you've gone through, that's just so inspirational to hear. And I'm sure lots of people are feeling that at home now. In the journey itself then, A, how long did it take? And B, were there any health implications during the journey for you?
I was about a year on the road from when I left London to the time I got to Hanoi, and my health did deteriorate. And I talk about this in the book because what was happening when I left London, the virus was quite low grade in my body, but HIV replicates rapidly, and it destroys your immune system if there's no medication to control it. So I was, the virus was just replicating. There was like this battle going on in my body all the time. And as I was traveling, I was slowly getting like sicker, and it started with I had an attack of a pneumonia, and a doctor in London when I left gave me this antibiotic called Bactrim, and he said if you get PCP, this particular kind of pneumonia, which is harmless to the healthy because our immune system will stop it from, attacking you. He said you could easily die. So fortunately I had this Bactrim I took it as a prophylactic to prevent this particular kind of pneumonia. But I was starting to get very tired all the time. And then my hair started falling out. And, all this was happening. And by the time I got to Hanoi, I'd lost a lot of weight. I had intermittent diarrhea because I have a lot of stomach issues with the virus. I had, like half my hair had gone. I was very thin. There's a scene in the book where for the first time in months and months, since Europe, I stood in front of a mirror, a full-length mirror, because I was staying in a hotel room in Hanoi. And I couldn't believe what I looked like. I was just like nearly a skeleton. But it amazed me how I managed to ride the motorcycle. Like it just, because we had become one in a way, when I got on the bike and got going, it was an effort. But once the bike was rolling and the engine did all the work. And, even I have that motorcycle today. I still have this motorcycle and it's got its own character in both of Ubuntu and the Silk Road book. And I just feel so connected with that machine. It's an amazing feeling because I've spent a lot of time on it, riding it.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking when I was reading about your journey that the amazing irony of there you are saying, well, I'm going to die anyway, and actually you end up picking a place in the world where if you're going to ride a motorcycle, it's the last place you want to be is Hanoi, because it's absolutely mad with motorcycles in Hanoi.
And because I had to put my bike on a train to get through China, and anyway, with my particular model of bike, the back brake is virtually non-existent. It's like a drum brake, and the front brake, the cable had been rubbing on something, and all the oil leaked out, so I had no front brake, and I rode all the way from the Chinese border to Hanoi, and most of it is downhill, and then I rode through Hanoi. But what I found in all that traffic is it's like all the little scooters would part like a school of fish, like a predator attacking a school of fish, because I was bigger than they are, but I just had to worry about the few cars that were on the road and the very few trucks because they were bigger than me. So it's like, the biggest one has right of way. So they just all get out of my way, which was great.
For those who don't know what we're talking about, if you're trying to, just as a pedestrian in Hanoi, if you're trying to cross the road, you really are taking your life in your hands. And I just looked at the people on the motorbikes thinking, I don't know how they survive a week.
Yeah, they just have it's a hierarchy thing, and they know what everybody else is doing. And probably I was so unusual, like I was the only big motorcycle. They just got out of my way.
Love it.
For that, yeah, it was very
Love
good.
it. And now, what's your kind of health situation now then, Heather? I'm guessing that with the new retrovirals and all the rest of it, they've had the effect that you really wanted them to.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, they're working on, the pharmaceutical companies are working on a cure. That's the next big thing with HIV, and they're quite close to it, But the way I look at it is the medications I'm taking are as good as a cure.
Right.
I'm very, very healthy. It's fantastic. In fact,
amazing.
There's no side effects to the medications I'm taking. I don't even really think about them at all. Like it'd be different if, there was all these deliberating side effects I had to deal with every day, but don't. And it's great. And there's 37 million people in the world living with HIV, and about 22 million of those people have got access to the medications that I take.
Right.
And each year, more and more people have access to the treatment. It's just those developing countries in Africa and in Asia that for some reason, because of where they're living, their isolation of small villages, that they are unable to get access to the treatments. It's great that there's massive foundations in the world, the UNAIDS and the Clinton Foundation and the Gates Foundation. They provide a lot of medications to people, and all that, support about breaking down stigma and encouraging people to get tested. I mean, really, if everyone in the world went and had a HIV test, and all those people who found out, if they're positive, went on treatment, HIV could go the way of polio.
Yeah.
It could be wiped. Because once people are on treatment, they're not infectious. They cannot infect. It's absolutely impossible for them to infect anyone.
See, that's interesting, Heather, because that's not, I mean, that, but that's not really a kind of widely known thing at all, is it?
No. And a lot of people, they forget about maybe that they have the one unguarded moment, and then they might get a little bit sick, and and the doctor doesn't even think about testing for HIV because they're not in that, supposed high risk category. They might be a teacher or a secretary or, some professional person. And then what happens is it becomes a late stage diagnosis. And it's, people have been on their deathbed, and then finally the doctor will think, oh, maybe we should test for HIV, and if they tested for that, weeks ago, or the person who, when they first came down with a really, really bad, pneumonia, and they started losing weight and feeling tired all the time, they thought, oh, maybe that one chance, that one unguarded moment I had when I went on a holiday to, Ibiza.
Yeah.
Maybe I've got HIV. It's just go and get tested.
Well, I mean, in your case, that just shows it even more, doesn't it? Because you didn't go for an HIV test. If you hadn't had to have that visa done, then you would never have discovered it until it was much further on. It
would have been a late, very, very bad situation. Well, one thing is I wouldn't have had the Bactrim with me, and when I came ill with the PCP, I would have thought it was just a bad cold or a flu, and I'll get over it. But and then I would have died in some place in Central Asia, possibly.
Wow. Well, it's all there in the book and more. It's an excellent read, Timeless on the Silk Road, and this is not really about the motorbike journey. It's about your journey more than anything, and that's what I found fascinating about it. Subtitled An Odyssey from London to Hanoi. Heather Ellis, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today, and no doubt there'll be more journeys in your future, and we can get you back on.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bill.
Take care.